What's up, Kansas City? I'm your host, Glenn Bryan Frizzell, coming to you today from the lovely campuses of W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center. Check out the center behind me. Isn't that wonderful? Wish we had time to read all the library books. Joining us today is our very special guest, Dr. Delia Gillis, who is an author, professor of African American history at Central Missouri State University in Warrensburg, Missouri. I don't have time to list all your accomplishments, or we'd be here half the day, Dr. Gillis. But suffice it to say you are multi-accomplished, and we are glad to have you with us today.
Well, I'm happy to be here with you, Glenn.
Wonderful. I'd like to jump right in and talk a little bit about the social economic structure of Kansas City. When one looks at the structure, you can't help but make comparisons if you look at another city, say like Atlanta, which has a thriving political community. You've had African Americans in the office of mayor, starting with Mayor Jackson, Shirley Franklin, and now Kasim Reed. And that's kind of led to a thriving black political as well as business community. When one looks at Kansas City, can one make a distinctive claim that this is an area where young college students are saying, hey, I'm going to graduate and begin my professional life here, begin my family, start raising kids, start the next generation? Does Kansas City have that unique claim?
I think Kansas City historically had that claim, and I think we still could make that claim. If you're looking at Atlanta, I think there's some differences in place, particularly if you look at the demographics. But I think Kansas City is really ripe with opportunity. I think living here in the Midwest, we have a better cost of living than those who may live on East Coast cities. So I think really young people do themselves a disservice if they don't look at the opportunities that we have here in Kansas City. And I just know historically it had been a place where African Americans came from the upper South, particularly the professional classes, social workers, doctors, educators actually moved to Kansas City in the early part of the 20th century. So a lot of the people that we may mention today are people who actually came here because of the economic opportunities.
A unique historical claim there. Now, Dr. Gillis, you are from Virginia, which
Yes.
is also the birthplace of the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about growing up there?
Well, I grew up in rural Virginia, Southside Virginia. It's pine trees and tobacco fields. I grew up in an extended family, living in the home with my grandparents and great-grandparents. My great-grandfather passed when I was an adult, and he was 106 years old. So in
Wow.
some ways, I grew up with a bit of an idyllic, family in terms of things that we don't necessarily have today or take for granted.
You told me that you traced your family history back, genealogy,
Yes,
by the way.
I can trace. As I said, I grew up knowing who my great grandparents were, and I can trace back my paternal grandmother, her grandmother. So I can go back to the 1840s in one line of my family, and trace back to my ancestors and my slaveholding families. And so I'm looking forward to continuing that research and doing DNA research to find out my specific African roots and Native American roots, as well as learning a little bit more about my European ancestry.
That's wonderful. I don't know if you know this or not, what's up Kansas City, but when you start doing genealogy research, it's real hard to go back past 1860 when we unfortunately were slaves, and a lot of times were listed as property. So that's quite an accomplishment in itself, Dr. Gillis. There's an upcoming gender, sexuality, and hip hop mini conference coming up this December at Tulane University in New Orleans. Everybody knows that hip hop has its origins in the 1980s. Dr. Gillis, if you were to write a paper about your own experiences, what would some key elements be in your 70s, 80s music, television, book, and film time capsule?
Wow. Well, I'm glad that MeTV is available, because a lot of the programs that are on MeTV are what I grew up watching: Gilligan's Island, Kojak, Hawaii Five-O. Those were things that I watched as a young child. The original Wild West, not the one with Will Smith. In terms of, and also the Cosby Show. I was a little bit older at that point. But music was very different because I grew up with the Philadelphia sound, and Virginia is for lovers. So the music that I listened to was really very harmonious music, I felt.
Friendly music.
Yeah, the Emotions, Teddy Pendergrass, Stephanie Mills, Peebo Bryson is in town this weekend. So those
Wow.
were, those were the songs that I grew up listening to. Shalimar,
Filter Fire.
yeah,
Shalimar, This Is
So
For the Love
yeah,
of You.
yeah. So it was a lot of love in the music, a lot of hope in the music. That's one of the things. I have adult sons, so one of the things that I talk about them with their music. A lot of their music is a little rough to me. It's a little hard. I don't necessarily always hear the hope. I think there's a lot of genius in the music, but I just don't necessarily hear the love in the music that I grew up listening to.
Yes, and that is why I'm a fan of The Quiet Storm and Midnight Love.
Yes.
Thank you for
Oh,
making
yes,
that.
yes. No,
that-
no. That's what I listen to on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of things that you guys sample now.
Let's talk issues. Kansas City Call Online House Representative Cleaver said that a government shutdown will affect us all and that public servants will suffer. He said, while I am a strong supporter of the Affordable Care Act, I am even open to discussing how we can amend and improve it. I am not, however, a believer in shutting down the entire government simply because one side can't get everything it wants. That is not how government should work and not what we were sent here to do, end quote. We at Cascade Media believe that politics should be a continual conversation between elected officials and the people in the communities they serve. Politics is especially a way for underserved communities to have their voices heard, their issue expressed, and we ought to hold our political representatives accountable for the decisions they make on our behalf while in elective office. I like to look at it as a ship metaphor with our politicians in the captain arena steering us, helping us hopefully make the right decisions so that we can benefit, and it's not just a power play. Given that House minority's position on the Affordable Care Act hasn't united Republicans and Democrats on this issue of government shutdown, do you think United States Rep. Cleaver's statement was cantankerous, or was it just bold?
No, I think it was honest. I think it was honest. Congressman Cleaver was on KCUR earlier this week. I follow his postings mostly on Facebook, and so he's consistent and he's honest. The shutdown hurts us all. It impacts African Americans in particular. When we look at the 34% of those who are laid off and furloughed now happen to be African Americans, so it really impacts us. The government position, employment in the government for the African American community for a couple of generations has been a steady and consistent career opportunity. So I think that's something we have to look at now, because if you use this metaphor of a ship, we may need to right that ship. We may need to actually mutiny on that ship, because
Wow.
that's not what appears to be going forward. I think it's important that the president will hold his ground here, because on one hand, if he doesn't make the concessions at the right moment, this will continue to happen because the precedent will be set. So, he's having to hold the line here, because if he gives in too soon, if it's not handled properly, it can happen again, over and over again, and it will be something that we will become accustomed to, and I don't think we want that.
I bet. Dr. Gus, I like to go on Facebook from time to time to keep track of my 4 devoted friends and to see what my former classmates and former student body leaders are doing. This particular comment came from Mr. Jonathan Hutto, who is a former student body president of Howard University Student Association. He's currently working on his doctorate in Washington, D.C. It's a comment or statement made by former President Jimmy Carter. I'd like to read it and get your reaction if possible. The disparity between rich people and poor people in America has increased dramatically since when we started. The 89-year-old former Democratic president said, the middle class has become more like poor people than they were 30 years ago. I don't think it's getting any better.
And that's true. That's true. Statistically, though we have made great strides in the African American community in terms of civil rights, and I think that's an important conversation. We're in the middle of a lot of civil rights anniversaries. But if we look at the economic statistics from the 1950s, African Americans were actually better off economically in the 1950s than we are today. So even though we have Oprah and Tyler, as millionaires and billionaires, we've always had African Americans to do well. We've always had an African American middle class, and we've always had African Americans that have struggled because of certain structural factors. That hasn't changed, and the disparity is worse, and we're definitely moving to a society of have and have-nots.
Wow, I don't know if we should take that assessment with some Tums medicine.
It's the reality.
It's a reality.
It's really the hardcore reality. So I think what we have to begin to think about is how do we deal with that? How do we deal with it politically? Does that change the political relationships that we have to push our agenda forward in the future? Do we come up with other ways of improving our economic standard, or do we just settle for what's going on? And so those are choices that we have to make. I think there are places where we can look in history and learn and be informed by what's been done in the past. But it is a very bleak but a very real reality.
Melissa Harris Perry blogger Tremaine Lee writes, in the months since a Florida jury acquitted former Neighborhood Watch volunteer George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, activists and protesters have set their sights on repealing the state's controversial Stand Your Ground law, which initially gave Zimmerman legal cover from prosecution. I know when I talked to you earlier, Dr. Gillis, you said for some reason you could not watch the trial.
No,
and that this particular trial reminded you of an earlier trial in Miami during the 80s, Arthur McDuffie?
Yes. I chose not to watch the trial because one of the things that I talked about for me, I'm approaching this situation as not only a scholar, but as a mother. And so I decided that I did not want to watch the trial every day, hanging on the edge of my seat. I chose to watch the trial after it was broadcast. So for me, the things that I thought about in terms of the Trayvon Martin case was in fact first a case in New York that happened when my oldest was about 9 or 10, Amadou Diallo. And that really touched me at that point because the young man was at home. He was in his apartment building, in front of his apartment building, and he reached for his wallet to prove who he was. But in reaching for his wallet, he was shot and killed. And so it was a very eye-opening moment for me. I called my son and I just had that conversation with him that if you're ever in this situation, I want you to be still. Don't move.
Wow.
You know, you have to be cognizant of that because this young man who had not done anything was killed because he reached for his wallet. So that was me as a mom taking that in. And then the other case that I mentioned to you in the 1980s in which they rioted in Miami, Arthur McDuffie was a local businessman. He was a veteran. He had a motorcycle, and there became to be some altercation or some incident between the police, and he was killed. He was brutally killed, and it's funny that you quoted Jimmy Carter. He was president at the time, and he actually had to go to Miami. So the Arthur McDuffie case was not unlike Rodney King that we'll see in the 90s, that it was, an incident that really brought forward a lot of issues, just like Hurricane Katrina unveiled issues in New Orleans around poverty that many people were not aware of. Yeah, so it's not just that event, it's just when that event happens that it uncovers even more inequality and problems. So when I thought about the Trayvon Martin case, I thought about what had happened in Miami in the 1980s. I thought about the Diallo case, which was the late 90s. And here we have Trayvon Martin, at home, at his father's home. But in all the cases, it's about our citizenship. It's about proving that we're supposed to be there, that we have a right to be there. It's something that our president is questioned about. It's about the citizenship. And that was my thought when the people, the birthers were talking about the president. I said, well, oh my God, it reminds me of slavery when you were a free person and you had to have your papers. Does the president have to have his papers, stamped on his forehead? So all of that, the underlying question is our right to be here.
History is repeating itself. Do you think that a injustice was committed when they found him innocent?
Oh, I did. I did. For me, the injustice occurred. I looked at that case at the very beginning. What bothered me about the case was the fact that in that neighborhood, I saw a diagram of that subdivision. And Mr. Zimmerman's home is on the other end of the far end of that, and he was actually closer to where Trayvon Martin's father lived. So in my mind, I'm thinking, I worry about my home. I'm not necessarily worrying about homes several blocks over, 4, 5, 6 blocks over. So for me, I felt it was a bit presumptuous and arrogant that he is patrol. Yes, he's neighborhood patrol, but this notion of being in fear for his life, go home and sit in your living room and shut the door. Where's the problem? So I always felt like he was helping to create a problem and leaving the vehicle and pursuing Trayvon Martin when he was told not to. Those particular aspects bothered me from the very beginning of the trial. I don't necessarily know if they were argued effectively. I just know that if it had been reversed, the outcome would have been very different. It would not have been acceptable for Trayvon Martin to have pursued someone. People have gone to jail for less. So those things really bothered me. I also mentioned to you, it bothered me the jury selection. I was not pleased with that jury selection in the beginning. I thought that jury selection should have been questioned. Because what you had happen was that in one of the jurors' minds, because of her age and her background, what the idea of being fearful of Trayvon or someone like Trayvon was normal to her. Was normal to her. And that's what we've got to change. We have to change this notion that it's okay to be afraid of young men like yourself.
Thank you for that comment there. Transitioning here, I don't know if it's quite appropriate talking about Trayvon Martin, but I'd like to get a little bit more sense of what's going on in your life, Dr. Gillis. What's playing on your iPad for the month? Pad. I'm still technologically challenged here. What shows are you DVRing? What books are you reading? What books are your students reading?
Well, right now I'm teaching my course on South African history, so I'm really excited. Everyone knows I'm a huge fan of Idris Elba, and so the new Mandela movie will be coming out in November, so my students will have an opportunity to see that film. They're reading a book right now, classic Peter Abrams' Mind Boy, that looks at South Africans going from the rural countryside and the process of urbanization and working in the mine. So that's one of the books that they're reading. And again, it has this really nice connection to what's playing in the theaters. I really have an eclectic sense of music, so I listen to a lot of what my 12-year-old is listening to because I want to know. I've always been very involved with my kids. I want to know what they're watching, what they're listening to. So my interest really reflects the pop and the rock, soft rock, R&B that my daughter likes to listen to. She's a budding singer-songwriter and learning to play the guitar.
Do you watch Scandal at all? Can you help me understand what the hype is about?
What the hype is about? Well, actually, I'm in the process of working with a colleague at Fresno State University, Dr. Deanna Reese. We're working on an article about Scandal, so we're trying to figure that out for ourselves. I do love it. I'm addicted, so I will admit it. I watched it last night. I think it has some really good storylines. It's melodramatic. I love, for me, because of my interest, because I'm a James Bond fan, I love that aspect of it. So that's something that
is the action that intense? James Bond, where he's running and jumping on trains and
not the action. Well, see, that's the new James Bond. Not the action sense of the James Bond, but the espionage aspect, the shadow government, the covert operations. That aspect of Scandal is something that attracts the program to me.
You said that you're working on a paper with your colleague. I wanted to show this before we run out of time here. I picked this book up from Southeast Library, and my mom and father saw it before I actually had the chance to open the front page. They were sitting on the couch talking about their childhood pictures that reminded them growing up in Kansas City, Missouri. This is the Black American series, Kansas City, by Dr. Delia Gillis. I want to get this right. Over 200 images collected from various cultural institutions chronicling African Americans in Kansas City history. Dr. Thomas Unthank's photo meant a little something to me, coming from Howard University, page 28. In your introduction, you wrote, with the African American community poised for a rebirth in the millennium, this work seeks to aid existing and proposed preservation projects. Dr. Gillis, what do you envision through your work to be the real challenge in really escorting in this rebirth?
Well, part of what I've spent my time here and doing African American history is bringing the Kansas City story to the forefront. I think it's interesting that you asked the question about Atlanta, and for me, it's about the fact that Kansas City is equally as famous as any urban metropolis
Really?
that we can name. Yet we don't necessarily exude that here in Kansas City. That was one of the things that I really appreciated about Mayor Kleber, who really tapped into our greatness, you know, having those expectations. And so when I started teaching first at UMKC and now at the University of Central Missouri, I wanted to make history relevant to my students. And so I encouraged them to do oral history interviews and to do local histories. Yes, we can talk about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, but what about the local leaders who are equally as accomplished in this particular community? So that's just really been my love for the past 2 decades, and I've had a lot of students over the years to do a lot of research and to begin to tell those stories so that Kansas City can take its rightful place among other urban areas, and we really know what that history is. And if you want to hold that up again, I think it was interesting, we were talking about economics, and that photograph is from the Depression era, and that is an Urban League dinner and social. And so the African American leadership was in a relatively good position at that time and pushed forward a civil rights agenda for this community.
Dr. Gillis, I really wish I could sit here and talk history with you all day, but unfortunately, our time is coming near to a close. Do you have any final thoughts, any comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I just appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you and to tell the viewers that this will not be the last conversation. Had a lot of conversations with Carlos Nelson, and I'll be starting a column on What's Up Kansas City so that we can continue to discuss African American history in general and Kansas City history in particular. We'll have quotes of the day and what happened in African American history, and it's going to be what Dr. G said. My students call me Dr. G, and so we'll be having an ongoing conversation, so I encourage you to come to What's Up Kansas City and look forward to talking with you again.
Dr. G, we thank you for your time. What's up, Kansas City? Carter G. Woodson once said, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. Don't let anyone control your history. Do your research, make up your own mind. Check us out online at www.whatsupkansascity.net for more video. And remember, the sky is the limit. Aim for the moon. If you miss, at least you'll land among the stars.
CMG wants you to always remember, the victory we call success goes to the best prepared. When you invest in your community, you are really just investing in yourself. Thanks.